copy of God's Word, turn to the book of Jonah, right there at the end of your Old Testament. We're going to be looking at Jonah, the 17th verse of chapter 1, all the way through chapter 2, in a message I've entitled Submerged. Jonah chapter 1, verse 17, through chapter 2 and verse 10, and Submerged. Remember the story to this point. God has called Jonah to go preach to the city of Nineveh. What does Jonah do? He goes in the opposite direction. Instead of heading 500 miles northeast to Nineveh, he heads in the direction of Joppa, which is going to be, heads down to Joppa and then west. And God actually confronts him on the open seas. As he confronts him on the open seas, they realize that Jonah is the culprit. And Jonah is thrown into the water, and that is where we find him this morning. In June of 1962, brothers John and Clarence Anglin, along with a fellow inmate named Frank Morris, disappeared from their cells in Alcatraz and were never seen again. An investigation revealed an intricate escape plot. The escape plot included homemade drills to enlarge vent holes, false wall segments, realistic dummy heads with human hair placed in the bed so that the inmates would not be missed during their night counts. The three men exited through vent holes located in the rear of their cell, which they had enlarged, and they covered them using a false wall. Behind the rear wall of their cells was a utility corridor that had steel doors locked on either end. So the three men climbed the utility pipes to the top of the cell block, and they gained access to the roof using an air vent that they had previously bent the steel bars on. Once they gained access to the roof, they climbed down a drain pipe on the northern end of the cell house and made their way into the water. They used prison-issued raincoats to make crude life vests and a pontoon-type raft to assist in their swim. A cell house search turned up the drills, the dummy heads, the wall segments, and the other tools. The water search found 2 life vests, one in the bay, one on the other side of the Golden Gate, oars and letters and photographs that had been carefully wrapped in a watertight bag. But no sign of the men was found. One of the many myths about Alcatraz is that it was impossible to survive and escape. Impossible because of the sharks that would be located in the bay. But the sharks in the bay are not man-eating sharks. The main obstacles are cold temperatures, strong currents, and the 1.25 mile swim to the shore. The reality is these men were never found. And several have made that swim from Alcatraz back to the shore, proving that an escape is in fact possible. Despite the best attempts of the U.S. Department of Corrections to build an inescapable fortress, there are some that got away. Some that entered the ocean, never to be seen from, never to be seen again. Perhaps you need to hear this like Jonah needed to hear this. You cannot escape God. Unlike Alcatraz, God's sovereignty cannot be escaped. Unlike Alcatraz, God's inescapability is not a myth. There is no place you can go where God is not. There is no part of His plan that you can change. God's plan will come to pass. He is sovereign over all things. Jonah discovered this truth as he was thrown into the raging sea. That's where we find him here at the end of chapter 1. As Jonah sinks to the bottom of the sea, verse 17, the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. This is the most famous verse in all of the book, but it's not the most important verse. We'll get to the most important later. But certainly the most famous. For many, they will point to this verse as their reason for unbelief. Unbelief in the Bible and correspondingly unbelief in God. But the fact is, this is just one of the many miracles in the book of Jonah and in the book of the Bible. To believe in God is to fundamentally believe in the miraculous. It should not be a stretch to think that the God who created all things can also give those things commands that need to be followed. The Lord appointed a great fish. The word appointed is used over 4 times in the book. As God exercises dominion over the things that he has created, to say that he appointed is to say that he ordained, that he summoned a great fish to be at that place, at that moment when Jonah needed to be saved. Many, even conservative Bible-believing Christians, are tempted to look at a species chart to determine which species of fish might be capable of swallowing Jonah. This is why so many well-meaning Sunday school teachers grow up telling the story of Jonah and the whale. It is not, in fact, the whale. It is a great fish. There's a desire to validate our faith by looking to the natural world for explanation. In the same way that archaeologists look for the remains of Noah's Ark or the Ark of the Covenant, the whole Indiana Jones franchise was a debt of gratitude to this instinct to look for validation of the miraculous. In June of 2021, a Massachusetts commercial lobster diver was swallowed by a 45-foot humpback whale, and he lived to tell about it. And every Christian watched the news as if their faith had just been validated. But let's be careful, dear Christian. There's danger here. To constantly look for evidence in the natural world to explain the supernatural subtly undermines the miracle itself. A miracle is a divine act beyond human replication or human explanation. We have a faith that has been tried and tested for thousands of years. Let the atheists be on the defensive to explain their position. God appointed a fish, and Jonah was in that fish 3 days and 3 nights. Some view this as an approximation. Some view this as 72 literal hours. Some view this as connected with the ancient Near Eastern motif of a 3-day journey to the underworld and back. Some view the 3 days and the great fish in relation to the ancient belief that death was permanent only if the body showed no sign of life for 3 days. And certainly Jonah was teetering between life and death. But no matter which view you land on, the point is this: God's power and grace retrieved Jonah as if he was from the dead, and the great fish was the vehicle God used. The reality is this: the miracle in the text is pretty anticlimactic. It furthers the story, but it doesn't escalate the emotional tension. It's almost a side note in the whole of the first chapter. Truthfully, it's not dramatic at all. The writer includes it in the story, not so that we'd be awed by the fish, but so that we'd be awed by what happens inside of the fish. God had something to teach Jonah, and the belly of that fish was going to be his classroom. One commentator points out the belly of the fish is not a happy place to live, but it is a good place to learn. How many of you can testify to the truth of that? That the belly of the fish is not a happy place to live, but a good place to learn. Have you considered that the crisis in your life is God's classroom for his instruction? Have you considered that the rock you push uphill every day is you being molded by the potter? That you're the clay in his hands? Can you honestly say that if you had everything that you want, that you would be closer to God? The belly of the fish is not a happy place to live, but a good place to learn. And that learning is reflected in Jonah's prayer in verses 1 through 9. Verse 1, Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God, from the belly of the fish. I called to the Lord in my distress, and he answered me. I cried out for help from deep inside Sheol. You heard my voice. When you threw me into the depths, into the heart of the seas, the current overcame me. All of your breakers and your billows swept over me. And I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look once more towards your holy temple. The water engulfed me up to the neck. The watery depths overcame me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. I sank to the foundations of the mountains. The earth's gates shut behind me forever. Then you raised my life from the pit, Lord my God. As my life was fading away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you, to your holy temple. Those who cherish worthless idols abandon their faithful love. But as for me, I will sacrifice to you with a voice of thanksgiving. I will fulfill what I have vowed. Salvation belongs to the Lord. We see an answered prayer in verses 1 and 2. Jonah prayed. Despite being in the belly of that fish, he prayed. And it marks something of a turning point in the story, because when the ship's captain urged him to pray in chapter 1, we have no sense that Jonah actually did that. Here he actually prays, not simply to a generic God, but to the Lord his God. Jonah was a believer, And in his prayer, we see a partial change of heart. We know that it's partial because if you go on to read chapters 3 and 4, you realize it's partial. But there is some change in Jonah here. We see a thankfulness to God. We see an expression of the Lord's mercy, his love, and his kindness. But Jonah is a book full of irony. Jonah was happy to accept the forgiveness of God, but he would deny that same merciful forgiveness to the Ninevites. God's will is going to be done. Nineveh was going to hear the gospel. Las Vegas is going to hear the gospel with or without us, with and sometimes in spite of us. God has a heart for all peoples. Jonah's prayer is expressed in the form of this poetic psalm. In verse 2, he said, Jonah called and God answered. And parenthetically, it's just important to note here that Jonah didn't think twice about getting saved by a fish. God could have sent another boat. God could have given Jonah triathlete swimming skills. God could have let Jonah drown and found another prophet. God sent a fish. Did Jonah order a fish? No. Jonah just wanted to be saved. God chose the manner of salvation, and Jonah never thought twice about it. Jack Nicholson's character, Colonel Jessup, is one of my favorite characters in the movie A Few Good Men. There's a courtroom scene at the end of the movie, a face-off between Colonel Jessup and Lieutenant Caffey, played by Tom Cruise. And the gist of the colonel's beef with the young lieutenant is, don't ask me to protect this country and then get bent out of shape when I do what's needed to protect this country. How many times do we do that with God? We ask God to do something for us, but then we get bent out of shape when he does it differently than we want him to, or we thought he would. And God says to you, I have neither the time nor the inclination to explain myself to a person who rises and sleeps under the blanket of salvation which I provide and then questions the manner in which I provide it. Would rather you just say thank you and went on your way. Don't get twisted with God when he answers your prayer differently than you would have answered your prayer. Because the reason you're praying in the first place is the fact that you can't do anything about it. Only God can. Jonah pleaded for help. God provided that help. And it's evidenced in the fact that he's in the belly of the fish and not still flailing about in the water. In fact, his ability to give testimony to what God did hinges on the fact that God saved him in the first place. And Jonah details his crisis in the next 3 verses. Look at verse 3. When you threw me into the depths, into the heart of the seas, the current overcame me. All your breakers and your billows swept over me. And I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look once more toward your holy temple. The water engulfed me up to the neck. The watery depths overcame me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. I sank to the foundations of the mountains. The earth's gates shut behind me forever. Did God throw Jonah into the depths, into the heart of the seas? No. The sailors did, right? So how can Jonah say that? How can he write those words? Because he knows God allowed it. He knows God was behind the storm. He knows that even when the sea stopped raging for the sailors on the ship, the current still overcame him. The breakers still swept over him. Jonah has come to grips with the author of his life. He's testifying to God's sovereignty over all things. He knows they were, verse 3, your breakers and your billows that swept over him. Jonah has recognized that God will not give him a pass on his disobedience. And the breakers and the billows were tools of God's punishment against Jonah's sin. So much of this prayer is poetic. It uses figurative language to describe the writer's circumstances and his despair. Words like banished, engulfed, watery depths, overcame. Those are all used as a matter of using figurative language in this poetic prayer. But don't let the poetry and don't let the figurative language undermine the reality of Jonah's circumstances or the reality of this miracle. The general imagery of drowning is replaced with very specific language. Jonah describes the seaweed getting wrapped around his head. That's a detail that's not hyperbole. That's a detail which adds to the rawness of his reality, a reality that saw him, verse 6, sinking. Jonah was as far away from human habitation and human assistance as a person could get. There was no help and there was no hope. How many of you have felt that way? When there was no help and there was no hope. Perhaps you've been there before. Perhaps you're there right now. You feel like an elephant was sitting on your chest. You feel like you were paralyzed and you couldn't take one more step. You ever feel like the world might be better off without you? It's quite possible that you arrived at that place because of something you said, something you did, something that was done to you, or just because we live in a broken world. But no matter the cause, you still found yourself alone. You're sinking, and there's no one there to see it. If that's you, then I want you to look at the second half of verse 6. Then you raised my life from the pit, Lord my God. As my life was fading away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you, to your holy temple. You are not alone. You're not alone. There is a God who stands ready to bring your life from the pit. You're not alone, and you are not without help. You may have been the cause of your sinking, but there is a God who is the source of your salvation. The despair of Jonah is met with deliverance from the divine. This isn't just a metaphor, it's an actual event. But you, God, brought my life up from the pit. This is many of the but God verses in all of the Bible. Genesis 8:1. But God remembered Noah. Genesis 5:20. Joseph said, you meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for good. Psalm 37:13. But God laughs at the wicked, and he sees his day coming. Psalm 49:15. But God will ransom my soul. Acts 10:40. But God raised him on the third day and made him appear. Romans 5:8. But God showed his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. 1 Corinthians 1:27. But God chose what is foolish in this world to shame the wise, what is weak in this world to shame the strong. 2 Corinthians 7:6. But God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us. Ephesians 2:4-5. But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. But God. Despite Jonah's sinfulness, despite Jonah's rebellion, despite Jonah's hopelessness, but God. But God raised my life from the pit. The language of sinking precedes resurrection. Decreasing before increasing. Descending before ascending. This is made clear in the incarnation, Christmas. Jesus had to descend from heaven to earth before he could ascend from earth to heaven. Salvation, you have to die to yourself in order to live for Christ. All of which is pictured in baptism. As you go into the waters, your old life is buried and you come out to walk in a newness of life. Incarnation, resurrection, ascension, the victory of the empty tomb only comes by defeat on the old rugged cross. Jesus had to go down before he could come back up again. Jonah had to sink before he could be saved. You have to sink before you can be saved. To get to the end of yourself so that you actually cry out to God for help. To believe in your heart that God raised Jesus from the dead and cry out that Jesus is Lord. And in that cry to God, he will answer. He is faithful and just. He will save you just like he saved Jonah. Jonah's salvation is met with a vow of praise in verses 8 and 9. Those who cherish worthless idols abandon their faithful love. But as for me, I will sacrifice to you with a voice of thanksgiving. I will fulfill what I have vowed. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Pray to the God who saves. That's our main idea this morning. Pray to the God who saves. I want you to underline that last sentence in verse 9. It's the most important in the entire book. Salvation belongs to the Lord. People may think of verse 17 from chapter 1, but it is this sentence that is the most important in the whole book. Salvation belongs to the Lord. No one deserves deliverance. It's an act of mercy by a gracious God. The Lord's sovereignty extends to all of his creation, both physical and spiritual. No one else can provide a way of deliverance except God. Verse 8 shows that God's invitation to salvation can be rejected. Verse 9 shows that no one besides God can offer salvation. Salvation for the sailors in chapter 1, salvation for Jonah in chapter 2, salvation for you on January the 14th, 2024. Those who guard, serve, and cherish worthless idols, they abandon, forsake, and forfeit God's kindness and mercy. Yahweh is the source of grace. Those who cherish other idols miss out on the grace that could be theirs. The grace personified in Jesus, the image of the invisible Father. Because there is salvation in no other name, because there is no other name under heaven by which men must be saved. Jonah has been saved from something and saved to something. Jonah's declaration in verse 9 is met with God's complete deliverance in verse 10. Then the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. God commanded the fish, and the fish did what it was told. Creation responds to the Creator. The whole story gives us a bird's eye view into the education of this pouting prophet by an all-sovereign God. Like all stories in the Bible, God is the most important character. He is the one who affects salvation, and He is the one who enables deliverance. Neither Jonah nor the fish had control. It was God and God alone. God didn't save Jonah solely for Jonah's sake. He saved Jonah for the sake of Nineveh. God put him on the land to complete his salvation and to reinvigorate his mission. So here's your take home for today. Pray. Pray. Pray to the God who saves. There is no prayer that God does not hear. There is no prayer that God does not answer. Sometimes His answer is yes. Sometimes His answer is no. Sometimes His answer is not right now. God hears your prayers. And there's nothing like the prayer that's prayed from the end of your rope or the belly of your fish. But of all your prayers, don't forget to pray for those who need to know Jesus. Who's your one? Have you noticed that Paul's prayers in the New Testament focus on changing someone's spiritual condition, not necessarily their physical circumstances? Listen to the prayers that Paul prays. Romans 15. May the God who gives you endurance and encouragement give you a spirit of unity. 2 Corinthians 1:3. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our trouble so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God. 2 Corinthians 13:9, our prayer is for your perfection. Philippians 1, and this is my prayer, that your love may abound in more knowledge and depth of insight. Ephesians 1, I keep asking that God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the glorious Father, may give you a spirit of wisdom and revelation so that you may know Him better. Romans 15:13, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace. Romans 10:1, brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. There is not a single prayer for someone's health, not a single prayer for someone's employment, not a single prayer for shelter or wealth. The focus of Paul's prayers was on the spiritual, and the focus of our prayers should be on the spiritual. Our spiritual condition and those around us. Who is your one? Thank you for joining us today. We're so glad that you're here. You know, I've grown so much as a Christian, but I've not arrived. I'm always looking to have people pour into my life. And so if you're a mature believer and you're looking for a place to drop roots and grow other disciples, right here at King's Church, we want to invite you to be a part of that. Thank you again for joining us, and we will see you next week.